We're sitting here in the garden of 14 Henrietta Street. I'm Gemma Sexton, Head of Visitor Experience, and I'm here with three historians, Donal, Fallon, Murtagh and Melanie Hayes. And thank you for coming here today. We're going to talk a bit about the museum experience and also connecting them to the books that have just been recently published by the three of you about the stories of the lives of the people that lived here in Henrietta Street throughout the 3 centuries of history that it's experienced. So you're all very welcome. I just talk first of all about the museum experience itself. You've all been on the tour more than once, many times. Can I ask you, within your specific area of research, what have you found that people really connect to? And we'll start with you, Melanie, about the Georgian time period and how you think that kind of works within the museum tour experience.
Well, for a start, I think they experience the Georgian side of the museum first. So in the first moments of them experiencing this building is walking up the stairs. And for me, that's a really special moment. The kind of parade up through the rooms of the house. And I think something that really strikes people is that this huge house, almost 50 feet wide, 4 stories high, was built for one single family, the Molesworths, about 1750. And that function will change, obviously, over the centuries, but I think the stories, certain threads of the stories remain the same throughout.
Yeah, I mean, I think the part I see is provoking the strongest reactions. Obviously I'm biased, but it comes from just after Melanie's period, because I think what Mel's saying is it sets people up seeing the sort of Georgian grandeur, and at some level they must know what the next part of the story is. They don't come into the house entirely unprepared, but actually seeing the different layers of wallpaper, of paint, particularly in that hallway corridor. Then as you go down to the basement, which is sort of towards the next step of the tour, to the darkest Dublin room in the basement, that sense of sort of contrasts, I think, is what really strikes an awful lot of people, and I think they complement each other very well. The sort of the care that's been taken to show you the Georgian grandeur before you then see the contrast of what happens in the later 19th century, which I think is a very powerful reaction people have.
Yeah, I find the Georgian period of the house particularly fascinating, because the perception in Dublin, I think, when people heard this museum was coming, was that it was a tenement museum. And even colloquially in Dublin, a lot of people still say, oh, the tenement museum. So that it opens with that very, very different narrative, which I think for a lot of people that come here is very unexpected. It's an unexpected narrative. They think of this street and it brings to mind Plunkett, Strumpet City, Larkin, the Lockout, all of that. And yet it opens with this totally different narrative. So I think the house brings you through, it's like a microcosm of the story of Dublin. In a sense, this house will bring you from the grandeur of the 18th century to the decline of the 19th, and then the re-emergence of Dublin as a capital city post-independence.
How do you see the role of your book, I suppose, in furthering our audience engagement? And what I mean by that is connecting with people, I suppose, people who visit here and people further afield who want to connect with this story.
It isn't possible, I think, in a tour the length of our tour, or any tour, to cover every suburban development in Dublin in the 20th century. We talk about where Peter Brannigan's family went. We talk about the specific people who lived here. I think people who come on the tour will find their own family history. Many Dubliners will find their own family story within it. But I think the book is a chance to, give a broader tapestry than we're able to do just on the tour. So I think it will perhaps, that 20th century book could make the story more personal to people. They'll read about where they live. How did the suburb in which they live come to be in the 1950s or 60s? So, yeah, I think it just allows us to bring a more personal story to some people. And that's very powerful in itself.
I have sort of the trickier one of my book covers, I think it was 120 years where I stop. So, obviously you can't get everything in a 2-hour tour or a 1-hour tour or a 3-hour tour. You can't get the entire 19th century plus 20 years in a single book. The hope I had was to sort of, I suppose, use the term complicate the narrative, to sort of poke at people's received notions of what the 19th century was like in Dublin, but also to sort of open the door for them doing research themselves, whether that's following some hints I throw out in terms of other books they can read, or something I always think about, just as a scholar, always trying to make sure if there's sources people can use remotely. I'm thinking the 1901 and 1911 censuses, which are online, things like the Bureau of Military History, resources which are for local history, for personal family history, trying to push people in that right direction, so that if this sparks an interest, they can develop those interests themselves. So I'm just showing them the way. That's the hope.
Yeah, that's really key, because such a wide variety of people, visitors, come to the museum from Ireland and from abroad, and they might come with a preconceived notion of what they're interested in, but on the tour something might spark for them. Oh, I want to know more about X. I want to know more about the Molesworths, Sir Lucius O'Brien, the 19th century, the 20th, and these books fill in those gaps that have to be in a tour like this, and they also give the visitor something tangible to take away. That's great. That they can almost put them in their handbag, put them in their pocket, and bring them home and relive the lives that they heard about while they were here.
I think it's worth saying too that they're a testament not just to 14 Henrietta Street, but to the digitisation of so much material in recent years. Dublin City Library and Archives, which is run by the City Council. So many beautiful historic images are now online. The Bureau of Military History, which we could pull on. So much great source material was at our disposal for these books, and I think it's a tribute not only to this place, but to other cultural institutions that we were able to create such beautifully illustrated books.
And I mean, if this pandemic has underlined anything else, it's the importance of digital resources, of being able to do history and historical research in a situation where you can't just rock up to the National Library or National Archive and pour through documents.
Yeah, I think that's a really crucial point. Maybe not even about digital access. Yeah. I think that these books actually make 3 different periods, 3 different, quite different subjects, accessible to a really wide audience. And for me, that was hugely, hugely important, to reach that broad audience.
Can I ask you, going back to the tour, just I suppose, what is your favourite part of the tour, and how you experience it? What kind of hits you when you're on a tour like this with other visitors and how they react?
For me, it's actually what they say afterwards. If you're a fly on the wall, or you're taking the tour as someone who's contributed to the making of the museum, just sort of going in amongst a crowd of people taking the tour and just hanging around the entrance hall afterwards to get people's reactions. You can get a whole range of different reactions, sometimes quite emotional, sometimes quite analytical. I mean, I think the great thing we're all interested in is how the way this museum will act as something of a lightning rod for people, like particularly for Donal, who have oral histories to donate, have memories of insights that this will spark. And you get a little sense of that, I think, when you're sort of milling around at the end of the tour. That would be for me, anyway.
I love to see people moving through the space. This museum is so unique in that the building is the artifact, and so how people experience the different spaces and the different eras of the building, it's very well choreographed, but it really evokes such powerful reactions at different times, from sort of eyes lighting up at the beautiful space, open spaces upstairs, and then you're contracting into darkness literally and subject-wise when you move downstairs. So yeah, I think that's quite powerful.
I like the surprising universal dimensions of it. Like, I always presumed that this was a very uniquely Dublin story. Yeah. But I've been on the tour at times where you have people from Glasgow, people from Salford, from New York City. And there's a kind of shared working class history in this story of housing, of tenements, of suburbanisation. So there you meet people who've been in, say, the Tenement Museum in the Lower East Side, or in the People's History Museum in Manchester. And they find something familiar in a museum where they probably didn't expect to find something they could identify with that strongly. So that really happens, I think, in the suburbs room. That kind of shared, if you will, experience comes true.
Donal, in relation to the story that you've researched, always comes to mind is this gentleman who said that the scariest day of his life was moving from a tenement in the city on Henrietta Street to Stoneybatter, which is less than 2 kilometres away. I just mapped it. And he said it may as well have been the other side of the world. His family were terrified on that walk all the way out there. So Henrietta Street itself was really its own world, really, wasn't it? And the streets around it.
Colloquially known as Hentown, locally.
Yeah.
And most of what was written on suburbanisation and the experience of leaving the city was written by one family. Traditionally, it was written by the Beahans, Dominic and Brendan Behan. And Dominic and Brendan were fantastic writers, but they had a real ability to ham it up, and often did. And they spoke about Kimmage. I live in Kimmage now, and I walk into the city every day, like it was the other side of the moon. Dominic's joke was to hell or to Kimmage, and Brendan said there was no such thing as suburbia, only Siberia. The way they spoke about these new estates to me was just so wild. And I always presumed that wasn't the universal feeling that Beans were hammering up. But when you interview people, they do talk about talk about it like they're being moved to Siberia. It's absolutely extraordinary. Places that are walking distance from the city, to them it was just a life removed, and that really comes through in a lot of the interviews. But now we'd consider some of those places, like Stoneybatter is considered part of the city centre. Harold's Cross is the same. It's extraordinary how people remembered being moved 2 miles from here.
Can I ask you all, when you're trying to piece together the lives of the people that lived here in 14 Henrietta Street, you're piecing together from different time periods and different primary sources, and so it must be very different, and there's different challenges, I'm sure, going into that. Can I ask you to elaborate on that, and we can, I'd love the comparison between how you guys worked and what you would have loved to have found more of, maybe. So we'll start with you, Melanie.
Well, say the Georgian period is a challenge. It's specifically a challenge in Ireland because we don't have a lot of documented history. A lot of it's lost, similarly the 19th century. But we don't know a lot about people, like the women that we've been discussing. We really have to piece together small scraps of evidence. It's like a jigsaw puzzle to create more of a picture or a tapestry of the whole. And it's a real challenge finding out about the lives that were lived within this house in particular, but more broadly within sort of domestic Georgian Dublin. And I had to consult a range of sources, old newspapers, letters and diaries. There is a wonderful journal written by one of the women who lived in this house, Anne or Nancy O'Brien, Sir Lucius O'Brien's wife. And it's her memories or memorandum on married life, and she wrote it for her children to give them tips, particularly her daughters, on life. And it's just really amazing to hear her voice and her experience. She's absolutely mad about her husband. He's the best of men, and she gives tips to her children, her indolent daughter Nicola, and her son Edward, who's prone to self-indulgence. But that's a really rare snippet. And the rest of it, for me, the challenge is finding the little pieces and trying to put them together.
I mean, I think the 19th century poses a slightly different problem. Yes, some of the same problems Melanie has in terms of trying to find, like you say, first-hand accounts, things that give you some insight into people's interior life, their emotions, domesticity. But in the 19th century, just because of the nature of the house and the street, because it then becomes a place that's not, for a period, isn't home to families but institutions, you then find yourself doing a very different type of history. You're moving from the elite Georgian period, and where you have actually private families, to like telling the story of the encumbered estates court and its commissioners, which is not a domestic story. It's it's a very odd story about sort of land ownership and legality. Then, of course, you move into the period where it's inhabited by tenement families. Then you have a different problem, which is that up until the 20th century, up until actually comparatively recently, working class people, by and large, did not write about themselves. They instead were written about. They were the subjects of studies, of parliamentary inquiries, of which there are many. And there's a lack of agency, you feel. Now, there are occasional insights. There's exceptions, of course, and sometimes you do get those little nuggets when people in the 19th century from the working class write about themselves, and they're really, really great finds. But by and large, you're sort of piecing together things through other people's perspective, and it's really important for me, I thought, to keep that in mind. I'm looking at evidence that's being produced by middle and upper class inquirers, by parliamentary commissioners, by people from the middle class who are in charitable societies, and they come with their own baggage, and you're seeing the world through their eyes, and you've got to realize that's the prism you're seeing through. Then once you get to the early 20th century, finally, working class people write about themselves, people actually take care to collect their memories. The Bureau of Military Histories, particularly for the revolutionary period, is a real goldmine. Then, of course, for Donal, for your period, you get actual living memory of people who are still alive, which is the best, I mean, really.
Yeah, and oral histories are a funny thing in the sense that one event can happen, 5 people can be interviewed about it, and they'll have 5 totally different recollections of what happened. That really comes true in the Bureau of Military History. When we're talking about, raising the flags over the General Post Office, like 7 different people claim in the statements that they raised the flag over the GPO. But they were taking it down and raising it all day. Someone's lying. So, first-hand testimonies, oral histories, they're memories. They give you very different sides of things. And I think sometimes they've been dismissed in the past because of that. That there's problems with, people's memories are funny thing. They can't really remember 30, 40 years later what it was like. But while they do have problems in that regard, I think they're still a fascinating source, Memory is an incredible thing to work with. But there's an abundance actually of primary sources in the 20th century to play with too. In terms of the Irish Architectural Archive. Yeah. So when you're looking at the suburbs, you have the very rich archives of Dublin Corporation. It's quite remarkable to go out to the Irish Architectural Archive and hold something like the drawings of a house in Cabra, the work of Herbert Sims in your hands. So you still have those primary source materials as well as the oral histories to work with. But I like the fact that 5 or 6 oral history interviews on one subject will give you totally different lines. I think that's human nature captured there.
The most interesting thing about oral histories, I think, is I know people who've worked on them, is you can get a different account of what life was like from the same person. One person? No, I mean, quite honestly, particularly with something like the tenements, where people can talk about, they can sometimes romanticize it, or they can sometimes tell you the beneficial aspects of it, of a sense of community and belonging and sort of the loss of that with suburbanization. Then in a totally different interview, the same person will go like, yeah, but you've been mad to have stayed in here. The improvement in physical, so there's both sort of sadness, a loss of sense of community, but also a practical appreciation of a betterment in living standards. Those can sort of diametrically opposed memories belong in the same person. I think that's
and we were very lucky in the sense that the oral history project began before me. Other historians worked on it, Dr. Brian Hanley and others. And some people were interviewed multiple times. Yeah. So I always think, the day someone is having could affect their recollections of the past and their feelings towards the past. That's really interesting about oral histories.
I love how they've informed the actual putting together of the museum here as well. We're not just getting the stories, we're actually, the physical fabric is created or is woven around their stories and their accounts. It's really quite remarkable.
And the emotional power the building has on not just people who lived in it, but buildings like it, because they see themselves in it. And they often say, which historians worked on this, or who did the research on what's in that flat? You're like, the people who lived here knows what was in that flat. So in a sense, the curators of the place, as much as anyone else, are those for whom it was home, and that's very unique in a museum.
Yeah.